Well, good evening, Trinidad and Tobago, and apologies for the late start. I was trying to have some, technical issues sorted out, and it took a longer time than I expected in terms of internet connectivity and so on, which is the point of this first installment of Tuesday Talk. The question of accessibility, the question of internet connectivity, and how that is really going to play out for so many thousands of students out there in Trinidad and Tobago. So I really want to first welcome you to this first installment of MSJ Tuesday Talk. Tuesday Talk is a series of talks that the MSJ will be engaging in, talks with you, Trinidad and Tobago, to really bring to the national attention issues we feel that are critical for us as a society. This first installment will be hosted by me, Ozzi Warwick, the General Secretary of MSJ. Some of you will also know me as the General Secretary of JTUM and the Chief Educational Research Officer and Executive Trustee of the OWTU. This week, Tuesday Talk, we will explore the world of online learning within the context of the evolution of the education system here in Trinidad and Tobago, and ask the difficult question: with the advent of online learning, are we going to lose another generation? I would like to start with a song. No, don't worry, I'm not going to sing, but rather play a song which some of you of a more mature generation may remember, coming out of Trinidad and Tobago's soul music culture, which, like Calypso, was part of our culture of social commentary and criticism. So I'm going to play that song for you and see if it sounds familiar.
In a little while from now, when our time has passed away and the world has turned around, children now I see wandering by the streets, hunger and poverty. Someone protect their destiny, but who's gonna be the one? Who's gonna be around? I hope their times won't be sad. Say a little prayer for the children, say a little prayer for the young ones, say a little prayer that they might grow to see the world more beautiful. Say a little prayer each night and day, safe before you pass away, so their hearts will be filled with joy, love and harmony. Whoa, whoa. At night, they learn to steal and how to fight. Their tender hearts are filled with war. No love they'll find behind prison's door. They've got to be aware. In their minds there must be no fear. Go ahead, you must be brave. Much more laughter than you must give. But who's gonna be the one? Who's gonna be around? I hope their times won't be sad. Say a little prayer for the children. Say a little prayer for the young ones. Say a little prayer that they might grow to see the world more beautiful. Say a little prayer each night and day. Say it before you pass away, so their hearts will be filled with joy, love and harmony. Say a little prayer. Put your hands together. Get down on your knees. You got to say, you got to do it.
Now, that song was written and performed in 1979 by the group Wildfire. That's a 1979 song where they were expressing concerns for our children. And later on, interestingly enough, Ella Andel would go on to hammer home the point with her song Missing Generation. And that too would have been a social critique of what was happening with our young people, with our children. Now, they weren't singing about the ruling class and even the middle class children. It was a critique of the social conditions of the society. Now, before this pandemic, there were so many clips that were being circulated across the various media, social media platforms of working class school children fighting, and one would say showing rage, real rage. And one could understand, because that rage is emanating from a point of view where they lived in a world that they did not see as beautiful. In neither were their hearts, according to the song, filled with love, joy, and harmony. In their world, their reality was one where their parents may have been sent home or hustled every single day to put a little food on the table. They saw their community and the people around them struggling every single day to survive. They saw a society that saw them as different, as something less than human. That was the old normal. So how can we now talk about the new normal, and we have never been able to fix or reconcile the old normal? Which old normal has implications for thousands of children who now have to engage in online learning. So in 1979, we were praying for our children. And then came the information age by the early 90s. And everyone talked about how technology will change everything. But in 2000, 20 years later, Ella Andel will have to sing, there is a missing generation. And we have got to find them somehow. This is why the question has to be posed. If 20 years ago we had a missing generation, will online learning result in us losing another generation? Recently in the Express, there was a report about students, about the grades this year, and that they were very low, and that it had students traumatized and devastated. And here's what I took careful note of. The schools that were actually being highlighted. And I began to wonder, when David Abdullah, our political leader, had observed that some years ago that 50% of our children, most of which comes from non-privileged school, that more than 50% of them were failing in through our school system. There was not a big hullabaloo about it. But now, because the grades are affecting students of so-called privileged schools, there is a whole series of reports about it. And if that is happening in the privileged schools, can you imagine what is taking place in the disadvantaged schools? We have to accept a hard, cold fact that education is determined by the social conditions under which you educate, by the intervention, direct or indirect, of society by means of schools. So does online learning change the social conditions? Or does the social conditions where people live place students, children of working class families, at a greater disadvantage? To explore this question of whether we can lose another generation, I want to do so by looking at the nature of how education evolved in Trinidad and Tobago, especially within the construct of a post-colonial capitalist society. And I want to start by making what some may consider to be a controversial statement. That is, that the education system is working in the interest of the ruling class elites, by performing three basic functions for these elites. One, it reproduces class inequality. Two, it legitimizes class inequality, and it works in the interest of the capitalist employers. Now, let me start with the reproduction of class inequality. This means that class inequalities are carried from one generation to the next. Middle-class parents can use their material and cultural capital to ensure that their children get into the best schools and are on top of the class. This means that wealthier students tend to get the best education and then go on to get middle-class jobs. Meanwhile, working-class children are more likely to get a poorer standard of education and end up in working-class jobs. And in this way, class inequality is reproduced. So you have a grandmother of the 50s, left school with just a school-leaving certificate, and find a job as a cleaner. Her child, a mother or a father of the 70s, went through the junior secondary school system and then senior secondary school system, and they eventually find work in a retail store. The children of that mother or father, they must now work his or her way through the same education system, only to land up hustling daily to make ends meet. And now their children must navigate the online learning world without the necessary material conditions, and therefore at a continued disadvantage to others. So what you have is class inequality reproduced over 3, sometimes 4 generations. The second part is the legitimization or legitimation of class inequality. Is legitimate. So the reality is that money determines how good an education you get. And I'm going to show that in a little bit with some interesting data. But people do not realize this, because here's why. Schools spread this myth of meritocracy. So in school, we learn that we all have an equal chance to succeed, and that our grades depend on our effort and ability. So if we fail, we believe now it is our fault. Now this legitimizes or justifies the system because we think it is fair, when in reality it is not. And this has the effect of control over the working classes. If children grow up believing that they had a fair chance, then they are less likely to rebel and in fact try to change the society, which places them at a disadvantage in the first place. Third, teaching the skills for future capitalist employers, that future capitalist employers need. It has been argued, and there is a correspondence between values that are learned at school and the way in which the workplace operates. So the values which are taught through what you could call a hidden curriculum, this hidden curriculum consists of those things that pupils learn through the experience of attending school rather than the main curriculum subjects, which are taught at that school. So students learn those values that are necessary for them to toe the line in low-income jobs. So I would now like to look at education in Trinidad and Tobago, having laid out a sort of theoretical framework for us to understand the origins of the social inequality that exists within the education system of Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, during the period of slavery, basically there was no education system as such, except for the children of the slave owners. Slavery and formal education of slaves were considered incompatible by the slave owners, and it certainly did not exist under Spanish rule. After all, I mean, if you think about it, slaves who provided free labor power need not be educated except to produce sugar, coffee, cocoa, etc. And this did not change with the arrival of the French planters and their slaves, and even after the conquest of Trinidad by the British in 1797. With emancipation in 1838, you begin to see a change as the plantation system of production still required labor, cheap labor power. Now, notwithstanding the early phase of the Industrial Revolution and with the famous Reform Bill in England of 1832, the prevailing idea in the 1830s in English society was still feudal. So the primary function of the lower classes was to work, be contented with their lot, and respect their social superiors. It is for this reason, for example, that it would have been religious bodies that pioneered the establishment of schools in Trinidad and Tobago. This concept of denominational schools, it was necessary because side by side with the emergence of this new working class was moral and religious instructions for that class and for the children of that class who are going to be the future workers. It was important that they emphasize the virtue of obedience of persons to other persons in the upper and ruling classes. Now, in 1869, there was a decision by the colonial government to allocate public funds to secondary education. However, here's the thing. The students who receive this publicly funded education were not the representatives of the people, of the country. If you go back to the records, you would see that the first secondary schools that were established with public funds, less than 1/5 of those students were what you call colored. None of them were either of African or Indian descent. This early provision for secondary education then set up a sort of pattern and set in mold a template that meant that secondary education was a privilege of only a small segment of the population, and that this segment was by no means a representative of the people of the country. However, there will continue the rapid expansion of the denominational, or what you call denominational elementary schools, which had started in the 1870s and had continued to the end of the First World War. Now, these schools were for the newly arrived or newly emerging middle classes that were growing in the colonies. But there was nothing for working class children. It was not actually until after the Second World War that a major school building program was undertaken. And you know why? It was the result of the 1930s labor riots, which brought to the forefront not just labor issues, but social issues, such as the fact that there were almost no access to health care and no access to education for the children of the workers of that time. By the 1970s, the government created the shift system of junior and secondary schools, which were considered the schools for working class children. So their curriculum actually differed to the denominational schools. So we had one country where you had in an education system 2 parallel curriculums running. These government schools were under-resourced and were stigmatized. The school system, our education system, therefore produced three classes of children, if you may. On the top were those who went to the prestige schools, because that's what they call them. And those prestige schools, of course, offered A-levels. In the middle, those were those who went to what you call just the secondary school, like Woodbrook Secondary, St. James Secondary. That's at the middle level. And then at the bottom, you had those who went to the junior and senior secondary school. So you had like 3 divisions. In one country, in this small Twin Island society, we created 2 parallel curriculums, and then at the same time, literally created 3 classes of schools. Now, this division and all the discrimination, inequality, and stigma that went with it did not change with the changing over from making junior and senior secondary schools to secondary schools, and now even with the offering of CAPE. You still had many thousands of children who did not go on to do A-levels back then, still do not go on to do CAPE now. It also did not change much, if at all, in any way whatsoever, the students in the primary school, at the primary school level. So the class divisions remained intact in the school system. Now, there are many government primary and secondary schools that did not even have basic school supplies. They did not have chalk. They did not have toilet paper. Parents and teachers would have to take money from their pockets just to buy basic supplies for these schools. And what was the net result of all of this type of division and so on? Well, let me tell you some interesting facts. In 2017, the SEA result gave a very interesting picture. And I just want the listening audience to hear how this picture is unfolded. You're looking at the top 200 students for now. Top 200, eh? Of the top 200 students, the largest number of students came from not even the denominational schools, you know. They actually came from private schools. That is paid private schools. These are the children of those who could afford private school education. The largest number of students of the top 200 came from those private schools, 18.5%. And interestingly, that went up to 22% in 2019. So more students of the private school system, of those whose parents are wealthy enough to pay for them to go to primary school, and some 22% of them ended up in the top 200. So money does make good education. 64% came from the denominational schools now. And guess how much came from government, from the public schools? Just a mere 17.5%. This is only now talking about the top 200. So if you use this as a sample size, it would mean that under 20% of students attending government primary schools will end up in so-called, want of a better expression, prestige schools. In 2018, the Ministry of Education revealed that 41.2% of students scored below 50% in maths, and 42.3% scored below 50% in English. This is English, the 2 most basic subjects. Even worse is that in that same year, over 2,000 students scored below 30%. And CAPE, no better. In 2018, 1,486 students failed, and this is now at the level of the CSEC, not CAPE, CSEC. 1,486 students in 2018 failed to receive a single pass. That is 10%. And in 2017, that number was 1,700. So if we extrapolate an average, 1,500 students failing to receive a single pass. If you check that over the last 5 years, that is about 7,500 students who did not receive a single pass. Where are these students? Ella Andel talk about the missing generation. Whilst only 60% got full certificate in 2018, that means that 40% of our children did not receive a full certificate. This means, brothers and sisters, Trinidad and Tobago, that thousands of our children are simply being prepared to join the reserve army of unemployed and low-income jobs. Now, it is in this historical context and structural edifice that we now going to construct online learning. So let us see if this online learning would help or deepen the problem. The first fact we must acknowledge is that the current school closures and the move towards digital education and online learning have actually emphasized the inequalities that already plagued our society. Now, the Chief Inspector of Education in the UK, Amanda Spielman, had already acknowledged that the closure of schools will widen what she called the attainment gap, at the least in the short term. Online learning, especially the way that it's played itself out, according to the Chief Inspector of Education, online learning is far from a solution to school closures, and the issues with this move to online learning is going to hit the disadvantaged children hard. Now, the virus, we know, do not discriminate between rich and poor. Understand that. But there is a big but. Those who have the means are in a better position to deal with its effect. I want to repeat that. The virus itself does not discriminate between rich or poor, but those with the means are in a better position to deal with its effects. So you have families with the means are more likely to have spaces for children to work, well-educated parents who feel more confident they can support their children's learning and make sure that they have good internet connection, they can pay for that, as well as have all the devices in the world that they need, whether it's phone, laptop, what's the other one? It's phone, laptop, tablet of all shape and form, all right? They can ensure that they have all of that. And ensure that they have access to learning materials. But poorer families are much more likely to struggle and are struggling with supporting their children to learn whilst the schools are temporarily closed. What do you think will happen? Wealthier families will end up ahead, and poorer children will fall further behind. In disadvantaged areas or in government schools, children are also much less likely to have access to the internet or to an adequate device for learning from home. It's not cheap. It is expensive to work or learn digitally. That is, it is an expensive thing to do. And students now need a reliable internet access. They need a quiet place so that they can work and concentrate. They need to have access to appropriate equipment. They're writing essays in terms of reading the books on the, whether it's the smartphone or the tablet. All of these things, those are not easy things to do. Not all homes have the reliable Wi-Fi, or they have a reliable computer, or they have a reliable tablet. And teachers who are already signaling concerns that their students would not have adequate access to any electronic device for learning from home compared to the wealthier denominational schools, and well, you could just imagine the private schools. So we know that wealthier parents can and do spend more on their children's learning. They can, and you see, it's not just the device. They can buy all sort of additional things. The headphones, they can buy headphones and speakers, etc. And any other equipment that will make the experience easier. Now, how many schools do we know right now are providing laptops and other devices for children across the board? I know for a fact there are schools where you have teachers and parents who are trying to raise funds to buy devices, who are begging for devices, seeing if people can help, who have a little old computer that if they could give. All right? Now, even if you have the right hardware, we also have to factor in that it's not always the case that children are digitally savvy. And I'll explain the difference, because we will say, yeah, but let us navigate TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Those apps are created to make social life easy. So that's very easy to maneuver or navigate. It becomes more problematic when you're talking about online learning platforms, which require now an additional level of navigation. It requires practice before you can really have to get it used easily. Schools are also not, especially I'm talking about government schools, okay? I'm not talking so much, even though they have their challenges. I'm not saying they don't, you know. I'm just saying that the already existing divide is entrenched because of these issues, okay? Now, some people may feel that it is probably better, this whole online learning thing, if children have more screen time than normal, because that screen time is spent on schoolwork, and that or it will take them away from watching TV and so on, right? But this isn't good in the long term, you know. Now, there is no doubt that students' educational advancement could be jeopardized if they miss like certain exams and so on. But if you think about it in the long term, if there is no real alternative learning, children would be placed at a great disadvantage, especially vulnerable children. Okay? Now, so much so that some teachers have suggested when school reopen, that you'll have to do catch-up classes. Then there's the issue of the physical space. Let's just talk about that for a bit. While children of families with greater means may each have their own room or may have the space in the house to be able to do their homework and to watch the lectures, that is not the case for many lower income students. Many of those homes are 2-bedroom homes, and in fact, 1-bedroom homes with a small, what we call a joining room, a kitchen and a bath. That's it. And sometimes it's not just one child, it's 3, 4 children, all in this small space now they all have to be online at the same time. So in a family of 3, in a low-income family of 3, they have to have 3 devices. They have to have a strong enough internet to make sure that these 3 devices can run on the Wi-Fi properly. But then where are they physically? What, somebody in the kitchen, somebody in the 1-bedroom, and then somebody in the joining room? I mean, how does it work in reality? Very difficult. The other thing about the question of space, the school space was also an escape, even if it's for a brief moment for children living in disadvantaged communities and dysfunctional homes. so that there was at least that brief moment they could sort of escape from that space. But here's what is happening. There is no escape mechanism. And therefore, these children cannot disconnect themselves from a hostile environment to focus on their studies. The school space as well also played an important role in building resilience for children. And not to mention, it provided at least an opportunity to nurture the ideas of solidarity across geography. Okay? Now, not every parent, and I'll come back to this question of geography, something that I think a lot of people take it for granted, right? I'll come back to that in a bit. But not every parent is able to provide the kind of psychosocial support, especially those in lower income who have to think about every day, think about where are they going to find money to pay the rent, where are they going to find money to put food on the table, all right? Now, middle and upper income workers, they are able, some of them, to work remotely, right, during this time, and therefore provide at least some level of supervision for their children. That's not the case for ordinary working people. Many of them have to work outside, and they have to go to work because they are being told if you don't come to work, you don't have a job, you no longer have a job. So here's what many parents have to, the choice that they have to make. They have to now decide, do they supervise their children, or do they put food on the table for the same children? That is the reality of the hard decision that parents have to make. And of course, they want to put food on the table. So many of these students are left unsupervised. And then on top of that, the government then stopped the food program. This means, in effect, that many of our nation's children will have to be doing their online learning on empty stomachs. And we all know that is not going to get them very far. Now, through online learning, an already divided society on the basis of geography will become even more entrenched. Because the idea that children can mingle and meet other children from other places with different socio-cultural background in a school space, that is now gone, you know. So now we have a generation of children who are going to grow up in knowing only one socio-cultural experience. And that could never be healthy for a society as diverse as ours. Schools, society, we as a society, have to help to make sure that students' basic needs are being met as much as possible. And we cannot act like this is business as usual. Now, as I begin to close, I'd like to make a few suggestions. Firstly, internet access must be treated as a right. The right to internet access, or the right to broadband, or freedom to connect, that means that all people, and in this case, all children, must be able to access the internet in order to exercise and enjoy their right to education. The right to education is a fundamental right. And in the so-called digital classroom, this means that internet access will have to be a must. In other words, you cannot exercise that right without accessibility. And of course, this brings into question the issue of privatization of communication. But I would leave that for another Tuesday talk. Secondly, we need to guarantee that students are able to enjoy the right to education, and in order to do so, the government must ensure that all students are provided with the necessary devices. All students. Thirdly, we must create a supervisory spaces or childcare facilities. So a collaboration between the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health will have to work together to make this a reality. Fourthly, we must bring back the school feeding program. Now, these suggestions, in all frankness, will not transform the education system. That will require a lot more. But these steps are to help mitigate what will obviously be a deepening and an entrenchment of social inequality in Trinidad and Tobago, which will in fact lead us to losing another generation. Okay? I think I would have really tried to explore this topic as much as I can, and I hope that the listening audience would really reflect on whether indeed we are going to lose another generation because of these online learning, because of this online learning. And the real reason for that has to do with the fact that it is built on an edifice of social inequality and an education system that perpetuates class divisions. Once that is so, we are going to end up in a situation where thousands of our children will not feel that they are part of this society. They are going to feel neglected. They are going to feel more neglected, more marginalized. And that level of hopelessness is going to really take this country so far backwards. If we are to be progressive and to think ahead, then we have to focus on what can we do to address the social inequalities that exist in our society, and how do we build or reconstruct an education system that can help alleviate or mitigate or even close the inequality gap. Not widen it, close it. I want to leave you with this song. Of course, it's a song we all know very well. And I really hope that those of you all who would have listened to this program would feel a sense of duty and responsibility to speak up and speak out against inequality. So I leave you with this song.
corruption. Father, only kindness can cool those cries that fill the night. Shout out for love and salvation. Are we to hear yet turn and walk away? Or should we stand with hands outstretched to show protection and boldly still the fears that make them stray? There's a missing generation out there who cares. They are dying, disappearing everywhere. Who cares? Somebody better pray. Somebody better pray. There's a missing generation, and soon if we don't find them, they're surely going to find us one day. There's a missing generation, and soon if we don't find them, there'll be no generation to care. Look behind every sound of thunder. Search beneath every mound of dust. There you'll find the price of our behavior, hiding from the cause of their hurt. Look how there goes another lonely son or daughter, with unshed tears and smiles we've never seen. Let's all reach out and snatch just one from their destroyer, and change the heart to one that's pure and clean. There's a missing generation out there who cares. They are dying, disappearing everywhere. Who cares? Somebody better pray. Somebody better pray. There's a missing generation, and soon if we don't find them, they're surely going to find us one day. There's a missing generation, and soon if we don't find them, there'll be no generation to hear.
Those were the powerful words of Ella Andel. Deep prophetic words indeed. So as we journey on to bring about social justice in this land, let us make sure that we go out and find our missing generation before they come and find us. Thank you, Trinidad and Tobago, for joining us on this installment of MSJ Tuesday Talk. Thank you and have a pleasant evening.
To prepare the seed.